The dry wind scraped across Clara's face as the wagon creaked to a stop in front of the main house. The ranch stood alone under a pale sky, its wooden boards scorched and split like old scars. Dust curled around her boots when she stepped down, each grain sticking to her skin as if marking her as property. Her father didn't meet her eyes. He stayed seated on the wagon bench, fingers curled tight around the reins. She could see his shoulders tremble once. Then he flicked the horse and turned away, leaving only a faint cloud in the air. The rancher waited by the door, motionless. His hat shadowed most of his face, but she caught the gray stubble, the heavy lines around his mouth. He didn't speak. He simply nodded at her bundle of clothes, then jerked his chin toward the entrance. Inside, the air felt cooler, but not kinder. The smell of old wood and stale stew wrapped around her. She heard the faint clink of pots from somewhere deeper in the house. A hallway stretched forward like a dark throat, swallowing every sound. He led her to a small room on the right, a narrow bed, a wooden chair, one window nailed shut. A thin beam of light struggled through a crack. On the floor, a chipped bowl of water waited, as if prepared long before she arrived. She turned to face him, hoping for a word, a question, even an insult. Instead, he just stood in the doorway, eyes sliding over her without warmth or anger. Only calculation. Finally he spoke. His voice was dry and flat, like the dust outside. Tomorrow. Work starts at dawn. Then he closed the door, leaving her with the sound of the latch sliding into place. Clara pressed her back against the wall. She counted her breaths, slow and careful, as if each one might be her last free act. In that tiny room, the quiet felt heavy, almost solid, pushing against her ribs. Somewhere beyond the walls, a horse stamped its hoof. A low whistle drifted in, then died. Clara leaned her forehead against the cracked window frame, her pulse drumming in her ears. Outside, the sun kept falling, turning the yard into an ocean of shadows. She realized she didn't know how many miles lay between her and the next house, or whether anyone would ever hear her if she screamed. She didn't scream. She watched the last stripe of light disappear and understood she had truly arrived. Clara woke before dawn, her head still heavy from restless dreams. The air in her small room tasted stale, as if it had been trapped inside for decades. When she touched the window, the wood felt damp and splintered under her fingers. A sharp knock snapped her upright. The door swung open, and the rancher stood there, his silhouette blocking what little light spilled from the hallway. His gaze pinned her like a nail to a board. "Kitchen. Now," he said. His voice was as flat and dry as the land outside. Clara followed him down the hallway, her bare feet brushing the rough floorboards. Every creak felt like a scream in the silence. In the kitchen, the old housekeeper stood by the stove, stirring something gray and watery. She didn't look up. On the table, a single plate and a chipped mug waited. "You eat when I say," the rancher said. "You work where I tell you. You do not leave the yard. You do not speak to anyone without my word." His words fell like stones into her stomach. Clara nodded once, afraid to meet his eyes. He leaned closer, the brim of his hat almost touching her forehead. She felt his breath, hot, sour. Disobedience is paid in pain. Understand? She wanted to step back, but her body refused to move. Her voice crawled up her throat, dry and small. "Yes," she whispered. He studied her for another moment, then turned and walked out. The housekeeper slid the plate forward without a word, her hands trembling slightly. Clara sat down, forcing herself to swallow the thin gruel. Each mouthful scraped down her throat, and she struggled to keep her eyes from darting to the door. Through the window above the sink, she saw the barn standing alone in the dust. A fence line stretched beyond it, disappearing into a pale, endless horizon. In that line, she saw her cage, invisible, but solid as iron. The housekeeper glanced at her briefly. There was no comfort in that look, only a flicker of pity quickly extinguished. When she finished eating, she pushed the plate away and looked at her hands. They already seemed different, more hesitant, more fragile. Outside, the sun began to rise, casting long, thin shadows across the yard. Clara understood. Each new beam of light marked another hour she belonged to him, another hour she would have to survive without breaking. The morning burned slowly across the yard as Clara stepped outside. The air clawed at her skin, and dust curled around her ankles like a hungry animal. She kept her eyes down as she carried a heavy metal bucket toward the barn. Her fingers ached already, raw from scrubbing the kitchen floor at dawn. Each movement felt like dragging a rock uphill. By the barn door, a figure shifted. A boy, no older than 16, leaned against the fence, his eyes fixed on a knot of rope in his hands. His face was thin, sunburned, lips cracked. Clara paused, unsure. The boy didn't look up. His hands moved in small, restless circles, tightening and loosening the rope as if he were tying invisible knots in his own thoughts. Behind her, a sharp cough. The housekeeper stood in the doorway, a gray rag wrapped around her head, shoulders hunched as if she carried the whole ranch on her back. Her eyes briefly met Clara's before she turned away, disappearing inside. Clara felt the boy's silence press against her like a wall. She opened her mouth, but no words came. A strange fear filled her throat. Not fear of punishment this time, but fear of breaking the fragile stillness. She stepped forward, pushed the barn door open, and slipped inside. The smell hit her first. A thick mix of hay, old sweat, and something sharper, almost metallic. Dim light fell across empty stalls and tools hanging like silent watchers on the walls. She set the bucket down and began sweeping straw into uneven piles. Each scrape of the broom echoed, too loud in the hush of the barn. At one point she turned and saw the boy standing just outside, still twisting the rope. He glanced at her once, then quickly away. She wondered who he was. Another prisoner, perhaps, or just another set of hands claimed by the rancher's quiet tyranny. His thin shoulders seemed to fold in on themselves, as if he had learned to make himself smaller to survive. From the far wall, Clara noticed a pair of old boots, dusty and cracked, resting near a pile of ropes. She felt a shiver pass through her. They looked abandoned, but also watched over, as if someone had only just stepped out. She knelt to gather the last of the straw, her hands moving automatically. Each handful felt like gathering pieces of herself she might lose if she didn't hold tight enough. When she stood, the boy was gone. Only the sound of wind crept into the barn, sliding over the wooden walls like a slow whisper. Clara carried the bucket back outside, her arms trembling. The housekeeper watched from the kitchen window, her face hidden in the shadows. For the first time, Clara felt the loneliness of this place pulse inside her chest, like a second heartbeat. Even surrounded by people, she understood she was utterly alone. The nights on the ranch felt longer than any day Clara had known. The darkness didn't comfort her. It pressed against her skin, filled her lungs, waited inside her dreams. Tonight, she lay on the narrow bed, her back stiff, eyes open to the dark ceiling. Every creak of the wood, every sigh of the wind slipped into her room like an intruder. Somewhere beyond the wall, she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone dragged a heavy sack behind them. She strained to hear more, but the sound dissolved into the night. She rose and pressed her ear to the nailed window. Through the small crack, she saw a faint light bobbing across the yard. The rancher moved toward the barn, a lantern in one hand. His head turned sharply every few steps, scanning the dark as if expecting to catch something in the act. Clara shivered. The cold from the glass seeped into her forehead. She felt small and brittle, a branch ready to snap under too much weight. The next morning, she moved like a ghost. In the kitchen, the housekeeper worked with her head bent low, eyes flicking up only when Clara reached for the water bucket. Their glances met for a second, a silent exchange filled with unspoken warnings. Out in the yard, Clara watched the boy again. He stood by the fence, same rope in his hands, but today his fingers worked slower, as if his thoughts had become heavier overnight. She noticed small details she had missed before. A dark stain near the barn door, a broken handle leaning against the side wall, an old chain half buried in the dirt. Each object whispered something ugly and unfinished. Near the boundary fence, Clara saw the dry trail winding away into the horizon, thin as a scar on skin. Her heart kicked against her ribs. She imagined stepping onto that trail, letting the dust swallow her footprints, leaving nothing behind but silence. In the barn, she paused at the empty stalls. One stall had a deep scratch mark on the lower plank, almost as if someone had clawed at it in desperation. She knelt, tracing the groove with her fingertip, feeling the splinters bite. A sudden movement made her flinch. The boy stood just inside the doorway, staring at her. His lips parted, but no words came out. Clara rose slowly, dust on her knees, and turned away. She carried the broom outside, her back tense. The yard stretched before her like an empty plain, each corner echoing with hidden eyes. When the rancher stepped out of the house, his shape cut against the bright sky. He watched her in silence, hands on his hips, hat casting a deep shadow over his face. Clara dropped her gaze and kept sweeping. Her wrists ached, sweat slid down her spine, but she didn't stop. Stopping felt dangerous, like inviting a storm to break over her. That night, she pressed her ear to the window again. The rancher's lantern drifted past the barn, closer to the fence, then vanished. In the dark, Clara understood something. This place was alive in its silence. Every creak, every breath, every small movement was a message. And she needed to learn the language before it swallowed her whole. The morning started thick with heat, pressing down on Clara's shoulders as she carried the pail from the well. Her arms trembled from exhaustion, but she forced each step forward, counting them like silent prayers. As she neared the kitchen door, she saw the rancher standing by the barn, speaking in low tones to the boy. The boy kept his head bowed, his hands limp at his sides. The rancher's hand hovered close to the boy's shoulder, an unspoken threat hanging in the space between them. Clara's fingers curled tighter around the pail handle. She felt a sudden sharpness rise inside her, a small flame in the hollow of her chest. When she entered the kitchen, the housekeeper was wiping the table with a dirty cloth. Moving as if her bones had forgotten how to stand straight, Clara set the pail down and glanced at the cupboard in the corner. It stood slightly ajar. Inside, she saw a small bundle of dry bread. The thought of taking one piece shot through her mind so fast, it almost felt like a physical jolt. Her fingers twitched. She moved toward it without thinking, her breath quick and shallow. Her hand closed around the hard crust. For a moment, she felt something almost like triumph. Then a floorboard creaked behind her. She turned. The rancher filled the doorway, his eyes locked on her hand. His silence weighed more than any shout could. Clara dropped the bread. It hit the floor with a dull thud, breaking into crumbs. She stepped back, but he closed the space between them in 2 slow strides. His hand shot forward, grabbing her wrist so hard she felt her bones grind. She tried to pull away, but he jerked her closer, their faces inches apart. "You think you deserve more than you're given?" he said, his voice a low growl, each word bitten off like meat from a bone. She shook her head, her mouth too dry to form a sound. He twisted her wrist until she gasped, her knees buckling. "Ungrateful," he hissed. "That's what breaks people faster than hunger." He shoved her backward. She crashed against the table, the impact stealing her breath. The housekeeper didn't move, didn't look up. She kept scrubbing the same spot on the wood, as if she had gone deaf and blind in that instant. Clara pressed her injured wrist to her chest, biting back tears. The rancher turned and left the room, his boots heavy on the floorboards, echoing in her skull. When the sound faded, Clara slid to the floor, curling into herself. Her breath came in shallow, ragged waves, each one scraping her throat. The housekeeper finally set the cloth down and knelt beside her. She didn't speak. She just set a chipped cup of water near Clara's knees and left again, her steps as silent as ashes. Clara didn't touch the water. She pressed her forehead to her knees, feeling the last pieces of that small flame flicker and die inside her. Outside, the sun climbed higher, indifferent. Another day began, and she already felt it had defeated her before she took her first step. The pain in Clara's wrist throbbed all night, pulsing like a small, cruel heart under her skin. She lay awake, staring at the nailed window, her thoughts spiraling in tight, choking circles. When the first line of dawn crawled across the floor, she sat up. Her limbs felt hollow, as if someone had scraped out her strength with a dull blade. She pressed her ear to the door. Silence. No footsteps yet. Clara slid to her feet, cradling her wrist. She opened the door slowly, inch by inch, until a thin crack let in the pale hallway light. No one stood there. She stepped out, her bare feet silent on the cold wood. She moved past the kitchen, past the darkened sitting room. Each doorway felt like a mouth waiting to swallow her. Outside, the air smelled of dust and early sweat. The rancher's horse stood saddled by the barn, chewing lazily, its ears twitching at the small noises of the morning. Clara's eyes shot to the fence line. Beyond it, the trail snaked into the endless dry land, a thin promise of freedom. Her breath caught in her throat as she took her first step toward it. One step, then another. Her heart hammered so loud she feared it might give her away. She reached the outer yard, dirt clinging to her ankles. She could almost taste the trail's dust on her tongue, the idea of it burning like fever in her mind. Then she heard it, a sharp crack behind her. She turned. The rancher stood by the barn door, his eyes dark and flat. In one hand, he held a coiled rope. In the other, a long stick, smoothed at the handle from years of use. For a moment, time folded in on itself. Clara thought she might still run. She thought she might get far enough to disappear behind the horizon, but the rancher's stride broke that thought in two. He closed the distance between them with a slow, steady walk, as if he knew she would never make it past him. She took one step back. He raised the stick. "Don't," she whispered. The word vanished before it left her lips. He grabbed her by the arm, twisting it so hard her vision flickered white at the edges. He yanked her forward, the stick smashing across the back of her legs. Clara screamed, her knees collapsing in the dirt. He didn't speak. Each movement was deliberate, methodical, a punishment rehearsed 100 times before. He dragged her back toward the house, her heels cutting lines in the dust. When they reached the porch, he threw her down. She hit the boards hard, her cheek grazing a rusty nail. Blood bloomed along her skin, warm and dizzying. The rancher stood over her, breathing heavily. Finally, he dropped the stick, leaned down and hissed into her ear. "There is no leaving. You're mine until you're nothing." He turned and stepped inside, leaving her crumpled on the porch. Clara stayed on the ground, her body screaming in pain. The yard shimmered in the morning heat. She could see the trail again, wavering in the distance like a mirage. Close enough to haunt her, but impossibly far. When the housekeeper appeared in the doorway, she carried a damp rag and a shallow bowl of water. She knelt silently beside Clara, dabbing at the blood. Her eyes stayed low, careful not to meet Clara's. Clara let her, too weak to resist. Her thoughts blurred and tangled like knotted thread. Inside her something shifted. Not gone, not yet, but bruised beyond recognition. The following days crawled by in a haze of aching muscles and dust-choked breaths. Clara moved like a shadow, careful and silent, each step chosen with the precision of an animal caught in a snare. Her wrist had swollen into a dark bruise, tender to every touch. The rancher avoided her unless he gave orders, short, sharp commands that snapped through the air like a whip. One afternoon, while she scrubbed the porch floorboards, Clara noticed the housekeeper standing at the doorway, holding a pile of linens. The woman's eyes flickered to Clara's wrist, then darted away just as quickly. After a moment, the housekeeper leaned forward and whispered, so low it almost wasn't sound, "Don't go near the shed at night." Clara froze. The words sliced through her like a thin, cold blade. Before she could ask anything, the housekeeper turned and disappeared into the house. the linens pressed tight against her chest. The shed. Clara had seen it in the far corner of the yard, half hidden behind the barn. A slanted roof, the door always shut, a rusted padlock dangling like a warning. That night, she lay awake, staring into the dark. Her mind gnawed on the housekeeper's words, turning them over and over like stones in her mouth. When the moon rose, pale and sharp-edged, Clara slipped out of bed. She pressed her ear to the door. No footsteps, only the deep breathing of the sleeping house. She stepped into the hallway, her feet soundless on the worn boards. Outside, the air bit at her skin, crisp and heavy with the scent of dry grass. The shed loomed ahead, black against the silver wash of moonlight. The padlock hung from the latch, catching the faint glow like an eye that refused to blink. Clara crept closer, her pulse thrashing in her neck. As she neared, she smelled something. Sour, almost metallic, mingled with the sharper scent of old wood. She reached out and touched the door. The wood felt warm, almost as if it were breathing. A shiver shot up her spine. A sudden noise behind her, the creak of a boot on dirt. She whipped around, heart slamming against her ribs. Nothing. Only the long shadows of the barn stretching toward her like thin fingers. She stepped back, stumbling slightly. Her eyes stayed locked on the shed as she retreated. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs refused, moving in small, clumsy steps. When she finally slipped back inside the house, she pressed her back against the wall, trying to quiet her ragged breathing. From her room window, she could see the shed, standing still and silent in the yard. But now it felt alive, as though it had watched her, listened to her questions, and waited for her to come closer next time. Clara slid to the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. The housekeeper's words circled her mind like crows. She realized that the rancher's control wasn't just in his hands or his stick. It ran deeper, twisted into the very bones of this place. And somewhere, behind that shed door, hid the proof of it. The morning sun was sharp and merciless, flooding the yard with a white glare that made Clara squint as she hauled water from the well. Her hands were raw, the skin cracked along her knuckles like broken earth. The rancher watched her from the porch, leaning against a post. He hadn't spoken yet, but his silence felt heavier than any shouted order. When Clara set the last bucket down, he stepped forward. His boots crunched over the dust, each step deliberate. "Come here," he said. She hesitated, her hands trembling. 1,000 small rebellions sparked in her mind, but each one died before it reached her feet. She obeyed. He stood close enough that she could smell the sweat soaked into his shirt, the acrid tang of tobacco on his breath. "You think you're clever," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. The softness frightened her more than his anger. He raised his hand and touched her chin lightly. She flinched. His fingers felt cold and heavy, like metal. Looking at the shed, thinking about running, he continued, eyes fixed on hers. "You think I don't see?" Clara opened her mouth, but no words came. Her tongue felt thick and all useless. He dropped his hand and stepped back. Then he nodded toward the boy, who stood by the fence with his rope coiled at his side. At the signal, the boy lowered his head and walked to the barn without a word. The rancher turned back to Clara. "Bring the rope," he ordered. Her stomach turned to water. She took one step toward the barn, then another, each step echoing inside her head like a drumbeat. Inside the barn, the air felt close and sour. She picked up the rope with shaking hands. The rough fibers bit into her palms. When she returned, he snatched it from her, coiling it expertly around his forearm. Without warning, he grabbed her by the hair, yanking her forward so violently her vision flashed white. He dragged her toward the hitching post near the fence, the same post where they tied unruly horses. Her feet scraped the ground. She clawed at his arm, but his grip only tightened. At the post, he forced her to her knees. She felt the rope loop around her wrists, cutting into her skin. Each pull tightened her breath, each knot sealing her fate. He stepped around her, slow, measured. You think about leaving and you forget your place, he said. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as if discussing weather. The first strike of the stick landed across her back, fire blooming through her spine. A cry burst from her throat, sharp and raw. The second came harder, driving her forward. The ground rushed up to meet her cheek. Dust filled her mouth, gritty and bitter. She lost count after the third strike. Pain blurred into a single wave, rolling over her, swallowing her voice, her thoughts. When it ended, he stood over her, breathing hard. She tasted blood, felt it pool at the corner of her mouth. You belong here, he said finally. You move when I say, you breathe when I allow. He cut the rope from her wrists and let her crumple into the dirt. She curled into herself, arms wrapped around her ribs, the world narrowing to a thin line of sound and light. The rancher turned and walked back toward the house. She heard the door slam, the echo ringing in the empty yard. From the edge of her blurred vision, she saw the housekeeper standing by the kitchen window, hands pressed to the glass. The boy stood near the barn, his head bowed, his fingers twisting the rope endlessly. Clara lay still, her breath coming in ragged pulls. In that moment, she felt the last shreds of herself scatter into the dust, carried away by the slow, indifferent wind. The days after the punishment bled into each other, slow and formless. Clara moved through them like a hollow reed, her back burning with every small movement, her wrists ringed in bruises. She obeyed without question. She carried water, swept the porch, cleaned the barn stalls. The rancher watched her often, his gaze heavy, measuring every breath she took. One afternoon, as the sky turned a dull, bruised gray, Clara was ordered to scrub the attic floor. The attic door groaned when she pushed it open, dust spiraling up like a swarm of tiny ghosts. The space was cramped and low, the roof beams sloping down so sharply she had to crawl. Cobwebs clung to her hair, her face. The air tasted of mold and old hay. She worked quietly, pushing a damp rag over the rough boards. Her knees ached, her elbows raw. In the far corner, something caught her eye. A loose plank, slightly raised, as though someone had tried to hide it in a hurry. She crawled closer, heart thudding against her ribs. With trembling fingers, she pried at the plank until it lifted free, revealing a shallow cavity underneath. Inside lay a small tattered journal. Its leather cover was cracked and spotted with mildew. Clara hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting the rancher to burst through the floor at any moment. She opened the first page. The handwriting was small and hurried, each letter cramped and desperate. He promised me I'd be safe here. He promised I could work for a while, then leave. But there is no leaving. I hear the others at night, the ones before me. I think they are still here, in the walls, in the shed. Clara's fingers shook so badly she nearly dropped the book. She flipped to another page. If you find this, you are me. You will become me. He watches everything. Even when you think he's gone, he isn't. The words blurred as tears welled up. Clara pressed the journal to her chest, her breath shallow and sharp. She flipped further, her eyes devouring each line. Mentions of the shed. Whispers about disappearances. Girls, boys, even drifters who had come to work for a day or two. He keeps things. He keeps us. Clara closed the journal, pressing it so tightly her knuckles whitened. The attic felt smaller now, the air pressing in, hot and choking. A floorboard creaked below. Clara's body stiffened, her ears straining. She heard the rancher's voice drift up from the yard, calling to the boy. She held her breath until her lungs ached. When silence returned, she slid the journal back into its hiding place. She replaced the plank carefully, erasing any sign of disturbance. She crawled back to her bucket and rag, scrubbing with renewed intensity, forcing her hands to keep moving even as her mind splintered into pieces. All this time, she had thought of escape as a distant fantasy, a line on the horizon. But now she understood. It wasn't just the fences or the stick. The true prison was deeper, older, etched into the walls and floors, whispered in the dark corners of every room. She thought of the shed, of the journal's warnings, of the unseen ones who had come before her. That night, as she lay on her narrow bed, she listened to the house creak and sigh around her. Her eyes stayed open, fixed on the ceiling, her pulse tapping out a frantic rhythm in her ears. The rancher's control was not just over her body. It had wrapped around her mind, her thoughts, her past, her possible future. She felt the journal's words pulsing under her skin like a second heartbeat. She understood now. She wasn't the first. And if she did nothing, she wouldn't be the last. The next morning broke over the ranch like a blade, sharp and pale. Clara's body felt as if it had been stitched together overnight from bruises and splinters. She moved through her chores silently, her thoughts coiled tight around the journal's words. Every creak of a floorboard, every flicker of a shadow felt magnified, as if the house itself was listening. Near the barn, Clara paused to dump a bucket of dirty water. Her eyes strayed to the shed, its door locked and sun-bleached. The words from the journal echoed in her skull. He keeps things. He keeps us. She turned and saw the boy standing by the fence again. His head was lowered, but today he looked different. His shoulders trembled slightly. His fingers twisted the rope so violently she thought it might snap. Clara set the bucket down and stepped toward him, slowly, cautiously. When she was close enough, she whispered, "Did you know her?" The boy's fingers froze. He didn't look up, but his breath grew faster, chest heaving. "Did you know before me?" she asked again, voice cracking. A single tear slipped down his dirt-streaked cheek. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Instead, he shook his head once. A small, jerky movement, more like a flinch than an answer. Behind them, a sudden bang from the house. Clara jumped, her heart jerking into her throat. She turned to see the rancher stepping out onto the porch, his eyes sweeping the yard like a hawk searching for prey. The boy backed away, slipping behind the barn without a word. Clara forced herself to turn back to her bucket, her hands trembling as she picked it up. All day she saw signs she hadn't noticed before. A thin scratch on the barn door at knee height, as if made by desperate nails. An old, faded ribbon, tangled in the weeds near the fence. A shallow depression in the dirt by the shed, like a forgotten grave. The housekeeper wouldn't meet her eyes at dinner. Her hands shook as she ladled the watery stew, spilling droplets onto the wooden table. When Clara reached for the bowl, the housekeeper's fingers brushed hers, cold and trembling. Their eyes met, and for a split second, Clara saw it. The memory of another girl, another story, hidden behind the older woman's guarded stare. That night, Clara lay on her bed, the moon slicing through the crack in her window. The house around her felt alive, each groan of wood a whisper, each gust of wind a warning. She replayed the boy's tear, the housekeeper's touch, the journal's desperate words. Each detail stitched together into a larger, darker tapestry. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't the first. The house held layers of girls, stacked one on top of another, each swallowed by the same silent tyranny. Somewhere deep inside her, the final shreds of naivety curled up and died. Her eyes stayed open until dawn, her pulse a cold thread running under her skin. She began to understand that her enemy wasn't just the rancher's fists or his rope. It was the history he had buried into every corner of this place. A legacy of silence and obedience that fed him, kept him powerful. Tomorrow, she promised herself, she would find out more, even if it meant facing the shed, even if it meant breaking herself open completely. The morning rose behind a veil of thin clouds, softening the edges of the yard. For a moment, the light almost looked gentle, but Clara knew better than to trust softness here. She scrubbed the porch steps with a frayed brush, her fingers raw and red. The housekeeper appeared at the door, holding a small pail of water. Her eyes darted to the barn, then to Clara, then down again. When the rancher's heavy footsteps echoed from inside, the housekeeper stepped closer. Her voice barely reached Clara's ears, a breath against the wind. "Tonight. Wait by the kitchen door. I will leave it open." Clara froze, the brush slipping from her hand. The housekeeper didn't wait for an answer. She turned and disappeared inside, her gray dress whispering across the floorboards. All day, Clara replayed those words in her mind until they tangled around each breath. She felt the tension coil inside her, sharp and electric. The boy avoided her eyes entirely, his hands working the same piece of rope into knots that never held. At supper, the rancher's eyes lingered on Clara longer than usual. He chewed each bite slowly, the muscles in his jaw bunching and releasing like coiled wire. She forced herself to keep her gaze low, her heart drumming against her ribs. When the meal ended, she washed the dishes with mechanical precision. The housekeeper hovered nearby, drying each plate, her hands shaking so slightly that only Clara seemed to notice. Later, in her room, Clara sat on the edge of her bed. She watched the crack of moonlight on the floor and counted her breaths. Each exhale felt like a silent prayer she wasn't sure would be heard. At last, she stood. The house was quiet, the walls heavy with sleep. She crept to the kitchen, her steps as careful as a fox crossing an icy pond. The door stood slightly ajar, a thin line of night pressing into the room. Clara's pulse roared in her ears as she slipped through. Outside, the yard seemed larger than ever, each shadow stretched and waiting. The housekeeper waited near the fence, her face half hidden beneath a ragged scarf. Clara approached, every muscle in her body taut. The housekeeper handed her a small cloth bundle. Dried bread, a rusted knife, a piece of jerky. Clara's fingers closed around it, her breath catching. "Follow the trail past the shed," the housekeeper whispered. "There is a dry gully. It will take you out past the boundary. He doesn't watch that path closely." Clara opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. The housekeeper shook her head quickly. "Don't thank me. Just go." Their eyes locked for a moment, a fragile bridge between two ruined lives. Clara saw in that instant the woman she might have become if she stayed, hollow, resigned, surviving in the shadows of another's cruelty. A sudden noise from the house, a door slamming, footsteps pounding the boards. The housekeeper pushed Clara away urgently. "Run!" Clara spun and sprinted across the yard, her bundle clutched against her chest. The wind slapped her face, cold and sharp, carrying with it the first taste of freedom. Bitter, wild, and terrifying. Behind her, the house loomed alive with shouts. She didn't look back. She couldn't. For the first time since her arrival, Clara felt a direction, a thin thread pulling her forward instead of tying her down. Tonight, she wasn't just a body to be controlled. She was a mind, a spirit, something burning too fiercely to stay locked in the dust. Clara's legs carried her to the far side of the yard before instinct forced her to duck behind an empty water barrel. Her chest heaved, her ears straining for every sound. She peeked around the barrel. The house stood lit from within, lanterns flaring like angry eyes. She could hear the rancher's voice, sharp and cracking, slicing the air as he barked orders. She knew he would search the barn first, then the fields. He wouldn't expect her to hide so close. Clara pressed her back against the barrel, forcing her breaths into slow, quiet streams. Her fingers dug into the cloth bundle, feeling each shape, the bread, the small blade, the dried meat. Tools of survival, not weapons. When the shouts moved away toward the barn, Clara crawled on hands and knees along the fence line. Thorns scratched her palms, pebbles cut her knees. She welcomed the pain. It kept her awake, sharp, alive. At the edge of the yard, near the shed, she stopped. The moonlight glimmered off the rusted padlock, and she felt the journal's words echo in her bones. He keeps things. He keeps us. A cold shiver rippled through her. She wanted to look inside, to know the full horror, but she forced herself to turn away. The truth could wait. Survival could not. She found the dry gully behind the shed, just as the housekeeper had said. It looked shallow, more like a cracked scar in the earth than a safe passage. Still, it was a line leading away. That was all that mattered. Clara dropped into it, her knees sinking into the cool dirt. She crawled forward, breath low and ragged. Overhead, the rancher's lantern light swept past, slicing the field in yellow arcs. She heard the boy's voice, distant and panicked, calling her name. Or what she thought was her name. She pressed her forehead into the earth, willing herself to become smaller than the stones, quieter than the dust. Minutes dragged into an eternity. Her arms ached. Her hair clung to her damp face. But the thought of stopping never entered her mind. The word stop had no place here. When the voices faded, she risked lifting her head. Beyond the gully, the dry trail snaked into the open land, lit only by thin streaks of moonlight. She reached into her bundle and tore off a piece of bread, shoving it into her mouth. The stale crust scraped her throat, but each bite felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Clara pressed her fingers around the small knife. She wasn't sure what she would do with it. Fight, cut through branches, or maybe just hold it close as proof that she had some measure of choice left. She forced herself onward, inch by inch, her mind a single burning line. Go, move, don't look back. As she crawled, she felt the weight of the journal inside her memory, each line an invisible brand on her skin. Those who came before her hadn't made it, but she carried their warnings with her, woven into her breath. She thought of the housekeeper's eyes, of the boy's silent pain. She realized she wasn't just running for herself anymore. She was tearing open the walls that had trapped so many before her. When she finally pulled herself out of the gully and onto the trail, the world felt impossibly wide. The wind brushed her cheeks, raw and stinging, but it was wind she had chosen to face. Behind her, the ranch house glowed like an angry wound on the land. Ahead, the dark swallowed the path, hiding what waited beyond. Clara gripped her bundle tighter and stepped forward, her legs trembling but firm. Tonight, she was more than a prisoner. Tonight, she was a blade carving her way into the unknown. The trail twisted under Clara's feet like a dying snake. Each step felt unsteady, her muscles clenching and screaming after hours of crawling and hiding. But she forced herself onward. Her bundle clutched against her ribs, the knife slick with sweat in her hand. Behind her, the ranch glowed with shifting lantern light. Voices rose and fell, echoing across the fields like the cries of wounded animals. She could almost hear the rancher's boots thundering in the dust, his voice clawing at her back. The dry wind stung her face, carrying the sharp scent of sage and old earth. She pushed forward, stumbling over rocks and thorn roots. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each one cutting her lungs. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats, slow at first, then faster. The ground trembled beneath her feet. Clara turned. In the moonlight, the rancher appeared on horseback, a black silhouette against the pale land. His hat brim shadowed his face, but she felt his eyes pierce her skin even from a distance. Her heart slammed into her ribs, an animal's frantic rhythm. She spun and ran, each stride a battle against the pain ripping through her back and shoulders. The horse closed in, breath steaming in the night air. Clara's legs buckled. She collapsed into the dirt, twisting at the last moment to face him. The rancher dismounted, slow and deliberate. He held a coiled rope in one hand, the other resting on his hip. His steps cracked dry twigs as he moved toward her. "Thought you could leave me," he said, his voice low, almost tender. "Thought you could run from what you are." Clara scrambled backward, her fingers sinking into the dirt. The knife trembled in her hand. "You're mine," he whispered, leaning forward. His breath smelled of sweat and old tobacco, a scent she would remember until her last breath. She felt the coil of the rope brush her ankle. Instinct flared. She swung the knife upward in a blind arc. The blade scraped across his forearm, opening a thin dark line. He roared, stepping back, rage snapping across his face like lightning. For the first time, Clara saw him falter. She saw the thin crack in his monstrous certainty. She pushed herself up, lunged forward again. The knife slipped from her fingers, but the sudden movement knocked him off balance. He stumbled, his boot catching on a rock. Clara didn't stop to see him fall. She turned and sprinted toward the trail, her body moving on pure terror and adrenaline. Behind her, the rancher scrambled to his feet, cursing. She heard the slap of his boots against the dirt, but each time she thought he was on her heels, the sounds faded, swallowed by the dark. Branches clawed at her arms, tore her dress. Blood mixed with sweat on her skin, but she kept running, lungs burning, heart pounding a brutal drumbeat. She didn't know how far she ran, minutes or centuries, only that the ground finally leveled and the sound of pursuit faded. Clara dropped to her knees, gasping. She pressed her forehead into the dirt, her entire body shaking. In the echo of her own heartbeat, she felt something shift inside her. The first, fragile thread of belief that she could win. She looked back once. Far behind her, the land lay quiet, the ranch lost to the night's black mouth. Clara wiped her face with the back of her hand. Her breath still trembled, but she stood. The knife was gone, but it had given her something greater. The knowledge that he could bleed, that he could be pushed back. She turned and began to walk again, her steps uneven but unstoppable. Each movement now felt like a small act of defiance, a declaration whispered into the endless dark. I am not yours. I am mine. The night swallowed Clara whole as she staggered forward, each step tearing open new seams of pain in her legs and back. The dry trail twisted beneath her, lined with stones that bit into her bare feet. But she did not stop. She could still hear echoes of the rancher's voice in her mind, snarling her name, promising to drag her back in pieces. But out here, the only sound was her own ragged breathing and the wind rushing through the brittle grass. She stumbled into a shallow ravine, her knees giving out as she collapsed against a cold rock. Her fingers clawed at the dirt, anchoring her to the ground as her thoughts spiraled. For a moment, she wanted to sleep right there. Let the dust cover her. Let the night swallow her forever. But something deeper than fear pulsed in her veins. A quiet, furious refusal to give him the ending he wanted. Clara forced herself to sit up. She tore open the cloth bundle, cramming the last piece of jerky into her mouth. The dry meat scraped her throat. Each chew an act of survival, of stubborn life. Above, the moon hung sharp and watchful. It felt like a single eye, urging her forward with silent contempt for her weakness. Clara pulled herself up, bracing her weight against the rock. Her muscles screamed, her vision wavered, but she kept moving. She followed the ravine until it spat her out into an open field, the grass taller than her shoulders. Every rustle felt like a hand reaching to drag her back. She clutched the remains of her bundle, though it had nothing left but crumbs and the small rusted knife she had picked up again in the dark. The knife had become more than a blade. It was a shard of her will, proof that she was still something sharp, something that could cut free. Somewhere behind her, a horse neighed, distant and angry. Her pulse hammered. She pushed deeper into the grass, bending low, moving like a hunted animal. Hours stretched and collapsed around her, until she no longer knew if it was still night or the edge of dawn. Finally, the land began to rise beneath her feet. Clara clawed up the slope, the horizon widening as she climbed. When she reached the top, she turned. In the far distance, the ranch was only a smear of darkness against the pale earth. The fences were lines drawn by a cruel hand, and the house looked small, almost fragile, a lie she had believed for too long. She realized then that the rancher's power had never truly lived in his fists or his rope, but in the space he carved inside her mind, the space that told her she was nothing without him. At the crest of that hill, Clara felt that space collapse, like a rotten board beneath her foot. She pressed her forehead to the ground, her body shaking with silent sobs. In that trembling, she felt the beginning of something new, a grief not only for what she had lost, but for what she might still become. When she finally stood, her bones felt like glass, but her spirit thrummed like a wire pulled tight. She stepped forward, leaving behind the echo of his voice, the smell of his sweat, the weight of his rope. Each step into the unknown land felt like tearing open a wound, but also like tearing open the sky itself, letting in the first hint of light. Tonight, Clara did not just escape a place. She ruptured the story he had written for her, ripped herself from his script, and though her feet bled and her mind splintered, she walked on. By the time the first gray light crept across the sky, Clara had left the ranch far behind. Her feet were raw and torn, her dress ripped into uneven strips that flapped in the morning breeze. Every breath stung her ribs. Each step threatened to topple her. She collapsed in a patch of dry grass at the edge of a wide, cracked field. The earth there was pale and brittle, fractured into long, crooked lines like old scars. Clara lay on her back, staring up at the sky. Colors seeped into the dawn, thin pinks and dusty golds, but they looked unreal to her, as if painted on a glass sheet far beyond her reach. A slow ache spread through her chest, heavier than the pain in her body. She realized it wasn't just exhaustion. It was the sudden emptiness of freedom. For so long, her world had been the rancher's rules, the sting of his rope, the echo of his boots. In that violent familiarity, there had been a twisted certainty. Who she was, where she belonged, what she feared. Now she had nothing. No fences to measure her days, no eyes watching her every move. Only the silence of the open field and the rising sun. Tears slid down her temples, vanishing into the dry earth. She did not sob or scream. The tears came slowly, like a leak in an old jar, unstoppable and silent. She turned her head and saw a cluster of low bushes nearby. Crawling on her elbows, she reached them and curled beneath their sparse shade. The small knife rested against her hip, cold and reassuring. Clara pulled her knees to her chest, listening to the shallow rasp of her breath. In the trembling rhythm, she heard a quiet truth. She had survived, not as the girl who arrived in the wagon, trembling and obedient, not as the ghost who scrubbed floors with her head bowed, but as something else, something she didn't yet have a name for. She drifted in and out of sleep, her dreams fragmented and sharp, full of flickering hands and rope coils and moonlit trails. Each time she startled awake, she pressed her palm to her own chest to feel the proof of her heartbeat. The sun climbed higher, baking the earth around her. She knew she had to keep moving, find water, find people. But for this one small moment, she let herself be still. She understood that freedom did not come clean. It came torn and trembling, edged in grief. It came at a cost that would echo in her bones forever. But it was hers. When she finally stood, her legs shook, her head spun. She leaned on the knife like a cane, using it not as a weapon, but as a promise. She would not go back. She took her first step into the new day, her eyes narrowing against the light. Her back still burned, her scars throbbed, but each ache reminded her she had chosen to carry her own pain rather than have it forced upon her. Ahead, the land opened wide and empty. Somewhere beyond the cracked horizon, there might be water, a road, a town, someone who might see her as more than property. She did not know if she would make it that far. She only knew she would keep walking. And so she did,